Hey everyone, welcome to SNES SHMUPS from worst to best. A special video where I'll be taking you through all 19 shooters released on the Super Nintendo in North America. We'll be starting with what I feel are the worst and ending with what I feel are the best. Rather than be a huge 40-minute long video, I'm gonna shoot off my opinions shotgun style in a highly condensed, compressed manner. For those that don't know what a shmup is, continue on and you'll understand soon enough. Run and guns like Contra and twin-stick shooters like Smash TV don't count for this show, and likewise, games that only deviate partially with small shmup sections like Gym Power won't be mentioned either. I also won't be talking about games that are shooty enough but focus on other elements, examples being Choplifter 3 or The Hunt for the Red October. And sorry Space Invaders, while technically the granddaddy of the genre, it's also not quite what I have in mind for this video. So, without further delay, let's get right to it. Number 19, DForce. DForce is a shooter so bad, it's barely worth talking about. The hit detection is especially awful, and it pretty much makes the game almost unplayable. There's also a zoom mechanic that's interesting on paper, but it doesn't really add much to the game. This is easily the worst shmup on the system. Number 18, Imperium. Imperium is a shooter that seems to be stylized after PC Engine efforts, but it can't even hold a candle to them. It's got boring gameplay, boring weapons, and boring music, and this makes for a relatively mediocre game. The level up system is novel, but like DForce, it doesn't really add anything meaningful. Not really worth playing. Number 17, Blaze On. An average conversion of a mediocre arcade game. There's an interesting capture mechanic in play here, but it doesn't do much for the slow pacing and mostly empty levels. Number 16, Raiden Trad. Potentially the worst version of the best shooter ever made. It's choppy, the sound effects are obnoxious, and the game balance is way off. At least the music is still good. Avoid it unless you like sound test menus. Number 15, Super Earth Defense Force. Based on the arcade of the same name, it's got pretty graphics and a cool weapon arsenal, both of which are marred by boring level design and an average soundtrack. It's forgettable overall. Number 14, Thunder Spirits. A conversion of an arcade game that was based on a Sega Genesis game. The varied weapon selection is nice and the soundtrack is okay, but overall it's average and inferior to the original it's based on in every way possible. Pass on this one and play the original Thunder Force 3 instead. Number 13, Strike Gunner STG. An unremarkable version of a relatively unremarkable arcade game. There's a smooth frame rate and lots of weapons, but there's really repetitive backgrounds and enemy patterns as well. A fairly boring effort overall that might only appeal to hardcore players when the game is experienced on the highest difficulty setting. Number 12, Darius Twin. A console-exclusive Darius game with decent visuals, a smooth frame rate, multiple pathways, and solid boss fights. Unfortunately, the good parts are plagued by bland music and some absurdly repetitive enemy patterns. It's not the worst on the system, but it's still far from the best. Number 11, Phalanx. Average visuals, an average soundtrack, and relatively average weapons and level design make for a relatively average playing game. It's good if you like challenging games with lots of bullets, but it's pretty forgettable outside of that. Number 10, Supernova, aka Darius Force. The follow-up to Darius Twin that manages to be less mediocre in some ways and unfortunately more so in others. It's also much harder overall, for better or for worse. Neither SNES game is a high point for the series, but there are far worse to be had on the system. Number 9, Axel. A pretty game where half of it is great and half of it is not. There's a lot of potential here, but for 50% of the game, the developers went for style over substance, and it really shows. Number 8, Space Megaforce. This is a fast-playing and technically sound game that ends up being a repetitive slog that goes on for far longer than any shooter should. The hefty amount of redundant object and enemy placement doesn't help, and the game also has a tendency of using fancy graphical effects simply because it can, and not because it should. It's a decent game, but pretty overrated in my book. Number 7. Biometal. This game has cool graphics, fast gameplay, and a unique shield mechanic that really makes the game. The soundtrack is terrible, but for some reason it also fits. The main weapon system could use some work, but the action's good and consistent overall. Axel and Space Megaforce might be better games in short bursts, but I feel Biometal is the more cohesive, reasonably paced package. Try the Japanese version for the best experience. Number 6. Firepower 2000. This is a shooter that manages to be both technically sound and fun. There's a minimal amount of slowdown, tons of enemies, huge firepower, multiple distinct playstyles, and 2-player simultaneous play. The soundtrack could use some more energy, but that's my only complaint. It usually goes overlooked, but it's definitely worth checking out. Number 5. Gradius III. This is a conversion of an arcade game that features some awesome music, awesome graphics, awesome weapons, and guess what? Awesome gameplay. The slowdown is some of the worst on the system, but the rest of the game sort of makes up for it. It's one of the better shmups in the system and a classic in its own right. Number 4. Aero Fighters. This is a decent port of the arcade game and features varying ship types, fast action, and responsive controls. The goofy characters also make for a fun experience overall with a lot of personality. The game is quite expensive, so emulate it or buy the Japanese version if you absolutely have to have the cartridge. It's definitely worth playing. Number 3. RType 3, the Third Lightning. RType 3 features more variety than Super RType, but the music and sounds have taken a hit and the game is much harder overall. The different graphic style might be a hit or miss for some as well. Still, the environments are creative, the animation is smooth, and overall it's completely true to the RType name and worth checking out. Number 2. Super RType. An atrocious checkpoint system makes it hard for newcomers to get into, but with excellent graphics, awesome music, and solid level progression, it's worth sticking around for and seeing through to the end, even if that means putting it on easy mode. Despite some slowdown, it's a very tight package overall, and it's my personal favorite on the system. Number 1. UN Squadron. This is a port of the arcade game by the same name that manages to be different enough that it can stand on its own alongside the original. Unlike most shooters on the system, UN Squadron gives the player tons of meaningful choice through varying difficulty options, level selection, as well as weapon selection. It also boasts an excellent soundtrack, nice clean graphics, super tight controls, and a frame rate that rarely drops. All this makes for the most well-rounded shmup on the Super Nintendo, and the most polished, consistent, and rewarding shooter package on the system. So there you have it, every Super Nintendo shmup released in the United States from worst to best. Keep in mind these are just my opinions, and it's quite likely yours will differ. That said, I hope you enjoyed this super condensed format, and if you'd like to see more of these types of videos, please post a comment below and let me know. For those interested in seeing a little bit deeper into these shmups, check the description box below for links to Let's Plays as well as reviews I've done on these in the past for many of the games covered here. Feel free to subscribe, and thank you for watching.